For most of us, environmental activism is a relatively modern idea. We see it as groups of people trying to restrict greenhouse gas emissions or prevent rampant deforestation. And while the modern environmental movement can be traced back to the early 19th century, the first examples of environmental activism can be traced back much further. The first example of environmental legislation is attributed to King Devanampiya Tissa, who in the 3rd century BCE established the first wildlife sanctuary on Sri Lanka. While environmental activism can trace its origins far back in history, those who assumed environmentalism was a relatively modern idea are not entirely wrong. More environmental legislation has been passed in the previous 2 centuries than in the preceding 2 millennia. So what caused this great disparity? Examining pieces of environmental legislation and the influences behind their passing illustrated a strong positive correlation between increased scientific knowledge and increased passing of environmental legislation. Which is to say, as humans have developed a greater scientific understanding of the environment and the effects that humans have upon that environment, more and more environmental legislation has been passed. One of the first examples of this came in 1306 when King Edward I of England issued a proclamation banning the use of sea coal in London because of the health concerns from the smoke it caused. Concerned with the devastating effects of the bubonic plague across Europe, nations began to introduce some of the first sanitation laws. The French king passed a law forcing butchers to dispose of their waste outside of the city of Paris in 1366. And the English followed that example in 1388 when Parliament restricted the dumping of waste and garbage into the Thames River and in ditches. The beginning of the modern environmentalist movement began in the early 19th century in response to the ongoing Industrial Revolution. By the mid-1800s, the large amounts of air pollution caused by the multitude of factories was widely accepted to be a major health risk. As a result of these medical discoveries, the British passed one of the longest-lasting and most impactful environmental laws in the world. Passed in 1863, the Alkali Act created a regulatory agency to inspect and regulate chemical factories in London. The Alkali Act and its amendments would continue to function in the United Kingdom until 1990. In the late 1800s, the conservationist movement in the United States became one of the first environmental activist groups to become active in the political sphere. Led by future President Theodore Roosevelt, the conservationist movement advocated for the management of natural resources and their conservation for maximum economic benefit and sustainability. The conservationist movement would succeed in the passing of many pieces of environmental legislation, such as the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act of 1936 and the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act of 1935. Following the Second World War, large amounts of chemical insecticides and pesticides, first used by the military during the war, were put into civilian use with little to no testing, with highly detrimental results. This was brought to the public's attention by Rachel Carson in her momentous book, Silent Spring. The public outcry generated by this book directly led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Some of the most recent environmental legislation, such as the Montreal Protocol and the Kyoto Protocol, focus on the issue of global climate change. If one takes even a cursory glance at the history of environmental legislation, the correlation between that legislation and scientific knowledge is readily apparent. However, this examination also reveals 2 other trends. First, that most of the legislation passed is primarily driven by the desire to protect human health and human interests. And second, that most of the legislation is reactionary, occurring after the event or events that illustrate the need for said legislation. This leads to a startling question. Could there come a time where the environmental damage is irreversible and the impact on the human species so severe that legislation comes too late?